My name is Richard Hiron. I'm an employment law solicitor, also known as the Hironator. And I guess to kind of explain my journey, I started out as an employment law solicitor, worked a lot with employees. And then I'd say about 3 years in, I was made redundant, went to work in the wonderful world of HR, was mistaken for an HR consultant after being sent all over the country dealing with messy issues for businesses, particularly schools. And I decided, okay, I don't want to be confused as an HR consultant anymore because I prefer working in collaboration with them rather than competition. Went back into being a solicitor full time and then became self employed. And I've never looked back. And I think, well, actually, that was almost 4 years ago now. And it's lovely because it's kind of like I can put myself in similar shoes or really the same shoes to another business owner because having had that comfort of being an employee and then stepping into self-employment, you resonate so much more with the struggles that the people who you've advised have on a day-by-day basis. So that's me in a nutshell. I'll be happy to get on to the presentation itself now if you'd like me to.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Brilliant. So what I'll do, um, I have said to Matthew and Alice that I'm trying not to make this boring and legal. So I have slides, but I'm going to try and make it as involved as possible. So let me just see if I can start the slideshow. That's always a good start. So the topic that we're discussing today is the hidden employee in your business. So we've kind of let the cat out of the bag. We are talking about directors, but that's good. So I will just give you a little bit of a summary of what we're going to discuss. So we've got the topic, which we've already discussed. We're then going to go through some examples, and I really hope they're going to be fun because whenever I do this, people get a lot of fun out of the examples in particular, which is kind of what we've dealt with already. So before we do that, you've kind of given me the answer to some of the questions already. So I won't drag you through the questions because I think we've kind of got the information that I would need to see if this is relevant for you. So as far as I can see, we have quite a nice mix of different directors filling different roles in the room, which is always good for this kind of topic. The thing is, I will just ask you to kind of bear in mind these points as we go through the presentation itself, because they might be helpful in and of themselves. So in particular, thinking about whether you have employees generally in the business, whether you are a, let's say, solopreneur, whether you are the only one in the business, or similarly, because we have a couple of couples in business, they might see themselves as being the only ones in the business. Naturally, the big one, whether you own a limited company or not, and whether you kind of get stuck in on the ground. And what I mean by that is if you do the day-to-day practicalities of the business without having anything to separate you from working in the business and working on the business. Or on the flip side, if you basically go into the business, you're able to sit down, you have a lovely chat, you have a cup of tea and biscuits, but you don't get stuck into the way that things are implemented. So just bear those points in mind as we go through. And that last point brings us on to what is called the office holder director. Now, this person will sit mostly at board level. They will be sat there on a day-to-day basis, coming in, going out, making decisions, but not necessarily being there full time. So they could have a range of directorships over many different businesses, and that's all perfectly fine. So they will make the decisions for the business on a day-to-day basis. But the key thing is, other people will implement them. So whilst they are in the boardroom, you will have the people working in the business implementing the things that they have said need to happen to drive the business forward. So therefore, because they're making the decisions and only focused on this, they aren't working on the day-to-day practicalities. And because of that, because they can step into various businesses, they can split their attention, they can split their focus to loads of different things. And because of that, because they're not solely focused on one business, they're very unlikely to be an employee. And then that takes us on to the complete flip side of all of that, or most of it, the employed director. So this person won't just sit at board level. If you're anything like me, you will meet people when you're out networking who are directors of limited companies, but they just work with that company. So they will do the day-to-day work alongside making the decisions for the business. So, as said, they make the decisions, but they put them into practice as well. They don't just sit there and disappear once the decision is made. They follow through completely, right to the shop floor. And that's pretty much that next point. They're the ones doing what needs to be done. And because they purely focus on that business, which might be their business, they might own it, or they might be a director of somebody else's business, that person is very likely to be an employee. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you on to the hopefully more fun examples to kind of help to kind of bring this out for you. So I'm not going to leave it to you. I'm not going to leave it on you on your own. I am going to guide you through the examples. So first off, we are purely talking about Christian Bale's version of Bruce Wayne from the Dark Knight trilogy from 2005 to 2012. I can see Andrew smiling because he knows me far too well. So forget every other version of this character. We're talking about this one. So I'll lay out the facts for you so that you can make a decision on whether he's employed or not. So he sits in the boardroom. Whenever we see him in those films, he's usually in the boardroom, or he and Morgan Freeman disappear down a secret elevator to basically have a briefing about Batman and all of that. So we don't actually see him working in the business. We see him more working on the business. Now, he is an ideas man. So if you haven't seen them, I'll try not to ruin the trilogy for you. But basically, in the second film, he develops an idea that Morgan Freeman comes up with to basically use a mobile phone as a sonar device. And what he does is he twists that idea to make every phone a sonar device. So he comes up with this idea. In the last film, he develops a fusion reactor for clean, affordable energy for an entire city. Now, those are his ideas. But during the course of that trilogy, we don't see him sat down tinkering away with machines. We see the results of what other people have done. So other people built those machines. He did not do it himself. And that's kind of leading us on to the Morgan Freeman character, whose name is Lucius Fox. So he is actually the CEO of the business. He is the one that carries everything forward from the idea that Bruce Wayne has to the people at the end implementing it. And we also see him giving instructions to staff as well, not Bruce Wayne. Now, this next one is quite a key point. Bruce Wayne is paid for a trust fund. We hear that in the second film. He is not paid week by week or month by month. His income depends on how successful the business is. And the last one, he owns the business as a shareholder. And we see in the last film that when his shares are taken away from him, they don't have to follow any kind of process to remove him. They just simply say, "You're no longer a shareholder, get out." So, based on all of that, do you think that he is an employee or not an employee? I think we're getting some comments. Okay, we've had a few answers. So, what I will say is that we have to take all of this in the round, and he has a separation from the business. So, I would say that in the round, he's not an employee because, for one, he's not paid through a regular salary, whereas an employee would need to be. And his contractual relationship with the business comes through his shareholding. He has the freedom to go around doing whatever he wants to do, and typically does. So, yeah, I would say not an employee. Now, this next one, I'm hoping you'll all recognize. So, this one is Willy Wonka. And similar rules apply. I know there was a Wonka film earlier in the year. I didn't see it myself. So I am purely focusing on Gene Wilder's classic version of the character from the 1971 film. So this one, I will admit before we dive into it, is trickier than the last one. So Mr. Wonka is seen throughout his factory. We see him in every single room that we're taken to, from the chocolate factory itself to the ideas room, the fizzy lifting drinks, his own quite unusual office, which I wouldn't want to work in myself because everything's all cut off and in pieces. It's strange. But yeah, he's seen everywhere. Like Bruce Wayne in the last example, he is an ideas man. However, he puts those ideas into practice himself. So he's very, very enamored with his waterfall, which mixes the chocolates. He's very, very keen on all of the ideas in the ideas room, and he has all of the recipes locked up here, particularly for things like the everlasting gobstopper. So he's a slightly different kettle of fish. Now, he has Oompa Loompas. We see him giving instructions to them, sometimes quite comically, throughout the film, particularly when a child tends to go missing. Now, here is a key distinction. His name is integral to the success of the products that he is delivering. Now, even though, yes, Bruce Wayne's name is over the door of Wayne Enterprises, he inherited that business from his parents and from the people who took care of it while he was not of age. In the 1971 film, we don't have any particular idea of how this business came about. So, as far as we know, this business is reliant on Willy Wonka because usually people mention his name and the product in the same breath. And the last point, at the end of the film, he gives the factory, bearing in mind the factory, to Charlie Bucket, not necessarily the business. So I'm going to ask the very difficult question of, do you think he's an employee or not? Oh, got an answer here. Okay, okay. Mm. Yeah, I think a few of you have cottoned onto it. So just to go back, I would say throughout most of these points, so the first five, I would say these are ones that very heavily link to him being an employee. And I would say that at the end of the film, he himself changes his employment status. So he said, I'm going to leave the day to day operation of the business to you, Charlie. But he doesn't say, and this is very like him, I'm not, I'm going to step away from the business. He does not say that. He says, you can have the factory, your family can move in, but he doesn't say, I'm leaving altogether. So I think at that point, he becomes an office holder director and changes his own employment status. So it's quite important to kind of look at everything in the round as a kind of factual matrix where you're figuring out the various points that say one way or the other that this person is an employee or not. And sometimes it's often best to not just with an employment lawyer or an HR advisor, but also with a tax advisor as well, to actually sit down and go through this. Because one of the saddest things about a limited company, I think, is that people can actually set them up, but they are a separate legal entity to the people who set them up. And that's in some ways quite sad because I think as business owners, we typically tend to say, well, I set this up. This is my baby. But there's also the flip side that what if things become difficult? What if things go wrong? I've sunk all of my money into this business and I might be, well, like Bruce Wayne in the example, kicked out of it with no money whatsoever. So, from an employment status perspective, if you are employed and let's say that the business is not successful, either now or in the future, then you stand the chance of getting things like statutory redundancy pay to at least partially compensate you for certain things that have happened in the business. The issue with that is you have to have a very, very clear definition of whether you're employed or not to be able to claim things like that. So, because, how can I put this? We have an unusual legal system. We have a legal system where the employment status test has been cleaved in half. It's decided by the courts, but it's also decided by HMRC based on the same case law, but it can lead to very different conclusions. So somebody could be an employee for employment law purposes, but not an employee for tax purposes. And there can be arguments to and against both of those things. So it's best to get it figured out on both sides to try and figure out whether it's the best move for you. If it is a good move for you, probably on both fronts, then having that director's service agreement to say, okay, whilst you might think you're self employed, you are actually employed by this business, which is still yours. But if things do go, let's say, awry, or if you need time off, or you need some kind of, let's say, holiday, or maternity pay, or paternity pay, then having something like this in place can be a massive benefit to you. So that basically brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you had lots of fun with it, particularly the examples, but I also hope it was informative. And I think what we're doing now is kind of stepping into a discussion, but please do feel free to ask questions if you have them.
Great, thanks, Richard. And if you could stop sharing, then we'll be able to see everyone. Thank you very much indeed. So, have you raised more questions than you've answered? Let's have a think. So lots of different perspectives here. Certainly for let's take NFBP, for example. We've got 6 volunteer directors. It's a community interest company, but we don't have a director's service agreement, even though we've got a very good HR director in Heidi, who's part of us. Is that something we should think about?
I would say probably not.
No.
So the thing with that kind of setup, whether it's a community interest company, a charity, I mean, even charities can have directors, and they can also have trustees working alongside those directors. But with an organization like NFBP, you have your own businesses, and you also have the business for the benefit of the community as well. So tying you into your own business, that might be a very good thing. But for somebody else's business, particularly one that's there for the benefit of the community, it might not want you to be employees first and foremost, because it's there for the benefit of many organizations and people. So in that kind of situation, I'd say likely not.
Yeah, no, but certainly that was the feeling early on when we started, I think, Rob, wasn't it? That obviously we're set up formally and we have articles, if that's the right word, and all of that in place, but certainly not a service agreement. But of course, the interesting one is that I'm executive chairman. So in a way, I'm blurring the lines between being CEO and being chairman of the board of directors. But I'm not paid as an employee. So it just gets a little bit grey in that area. But I trust on our HR advisor to keep us on the straight and narrow with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think commercial reality with these situations always is something to bear in mind. So the business might not be at the stage, I mean, just talking generally, where it could afford to pay a salary. But the more it becomes successful, the more somebody might think, actually, I need to have something in place that actually protects me, because things are starting to move with such a momentum that it's not within my control anymore. It's something that is moving away from me, that needs some kind of rules and regulations on how things work.
And certainly that's, our ambition is that we will have employees in the future, and that's something that we would work towards. Anyone else that got any burning questions around employment law in this area in particular?
It's interesting that sometimes there can be different considerations under employment law to those that would prevail under taxation law. You tend to think of the two blurring together, but there may be clear cases where they don't. Someone is of one status from a taxation point of view, but of another from a legal responsibilities or asset ownership point of view.
Yeah, and I'm mindful that we've had a lot of announcements that the Labour government is actually very concerned about this, because it's led to different determinations. You've got the tools online where you can check, but it's only checking from a tax perspective, whereas it's leaving you out in the cold and potentially for the courts to come in and make a decision for you on basically the employment law side of things. So it's good that they're looking into it. I hope they do it in the right way, because they've got decades worth of law to go through to try and get something that we can all live by and work by.
Well, that I think is the danger. If coming from a point of view about employee rights, and I certainly accept that there have been cases where individuals, particularly in lower paid jobs, have been exploited with 0 hours contracts and not knowing where they are from 1 week to the next if they're agency workers, etc., etc. Completely get that can be a horrible, insecure situation for someone. But equally, you need an economy where you're able to flex the employment role of the business depending on circumstances. And if you end up with a lot of employees that you would have to make redundant because business circumstances have changed, then that's a barrier to growth to some extent. And I think I'm getting way off topic here, but I think we're seeing that as a result of the recent changes to A, day one employment rights, and B, the increases in NI contributions, which mean that employee is a bigger commitment. I won't use the word burden because they shouldn't be, but a bigger commitment. I think it's holding companies back from employing at the moment.
One of my concerns when it was actually announced, particularly national insurance, was with it being October, I was thinking, right, that's a lot of redundancies coming in December then. So I know what you mean.
I think the risk is maybe not quite as dire as redundancies, but I'm fairly sure from what I'm seeing. So I'm a regional chair for the Federation of Small Businesses, so I get to talk to quite a few small businesses. I think people are holding back on recruitment. Anyway, I'm way off topic from hidden directors at the moment.
That's fine. That's fine. I mean, we were talking about an employed director who would be an employee, so it's still relevant.
Yeah. I have a situation where I have a guy who does a lot of work for me as a freelancer, and we're both very clear he's a freelancer. He wants to be a freelancer. He has other clients. He passes all the rules around determination of his own work schedule, using his own equipment, etc., etc. His wife wanted him to become a director of my business because she wanted the status. And I said to him, I can make you a director in half an hour from now, John. It actually is disadvantageous to you. It will cost you money. And he went away and talked to his accountant, and she said, yeah, John, it will cost you money. And I think his wife has now accepted that is the way things are. But it was an interesting discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like I say, I mean, it's not just an employment law determination. It's definitely worth having talks with tax lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, because it's a multi-layered picture, purely because of the way that the law is constructed in this country.
Thanks, Rob. Any other thoughts or questions?
No, I only have a silly question like to Rob, because you've mentioned having somebody else coming and joining your company as a director would cost them money. How does this work? Why would that be?
It was because he is currently paid as a freelancer.
Yeah.
If he came on board and I started paying him through dividends, for example, then it wouldn't have worked out particularly favourably for him in terms of his take-home pay.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I think it's mainly because as a freelancer, he's able to treat himself as self-employed, and therefore he can claim different expenses in different ways than he might do if he came onto payroll.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Thank you.
Richard, just to liven things up, what do people most often get wrong?
Oh, great. In terms of director service agreements, or
in the topic, well, yeah, other things.
having no agreement at all, I would think, is the biggest error.
Yeah, and not abiding by it, not accounting for things like other agreements in place, like shareholders agreements. And the worst one that they can possibly do is doing something that the Articles of Association of the company say that they cannot do or should not do. So it's a living document, very much. So if you want to keep it as alive as possible and not have to come and see somebody like me to get it refreshed every time, it's best to say, okay, this document, the Articles of Association, deal with the rules of the company, and nothing other than that can set the rules of the company. So basically keeping the director's service agreement as just an employment contract in many ways.
Yeah, good. Thank you.